Having travelled a good piece of it myself, I feel a part, almost a member of this enterprise. You call yourselves Americans, but you're really just transplanted Englishmen. Look at your names. Lee, Hood, Longstreet, Jackson, Stewart. My people were Dutch.
I've recently been reading one of our own historians' efforts, written by James Cowan, on the New Zealand Wars that took place between the first settlers here in New Zealand, the Māori from eastern Polynesia, and the colonials that predominantly came from Great Britain that would follow. Coincidentally, and something I've considered myself, he draws upon several parallels between the history of New Zealand and the history of the United States of America, recognizing that we might have even more in common with the United States of America than even England or Australia. He draws light comparisons between the Māori who would struggle to regain their independence post the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, with the likes of the Patriots, the Native Americans, and yes, even the Confederates.
Checkmate Lincolnites!
At first, I'd never really intended to create a YouTube channel, and certainly not to talk to a history that wasn't my own. The closest connection I know of would be through a great-grandfather from the Azores, Portugal, serving on the repair and maintenance of ships, which included the USS Kearsarge, that famously sunk the CSS Alabama off the coast of Cherbourg, France. That said, it doesn't mean I haven't had any exposure or experience to talk on the subject. I did live for a time in the great red and conservative state of California. I have also travelled down to Texas on numerous occasions, visited the Alamo, crossed over to Louisiana and stayed a few nights in New Orleans, ventured to Tennessee and to the battlefield at Lookout Mountain, to the battlefield of Chickamauga, where The Rock, not that Rock, would make his famous stand in face of a sweeping tide of Confederates upon Snodgrass Hill, and supported by the excellent Gordon Granger. I passed through Fredericksburg, have wandered about Richmond, Virginia, took a guided tour around the White House of the Confederacy. That was different. Spent some time in Florida, went northward to Washington DC and through New York. Still, I am not an American, and there are plenty of scholars and historians that can talk to this subject, and to a degree well beyond my own capabilities and knowledge. It reminds of one of my favourite South Park episodes, with apologies to Jesse Jackson.
I get it now. I don't get it.
I don't get it either. How can I get it? How can I truly understand it? But then something changed. I saw Atun-Shei's, or Andrew Rackett's, review on the movie Gods and Generals, and while I agree with a fair amount of the points he raises, I do also disagree to some extent, and where I did find some good quality aspects along the way, including the performances of Lang and Duvall as Jackson and Lee respectively, although I do consider it a rather disappointing adaptation to a much better novel, hence my own effort framed as the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so I have changed my mind. Perhaps as a non-American, but as someone who's somewhat religiously read about the subject since childhood, perhaps I might be able to contribute at least something, anything, to the Civil War discourse. Just maybe I might even bring something that resembles objectivity, because that often appears to be lacking in many interpretations of this history that I encounter. Let's begin with the first topic, shall we? The cause.
Oh my, the cause.
Yes, Richard Jordan, may you rest in peace. Let us talk about the cause. And honestly, to the many interpretations and accounts, it truly baffles me how this still remains such a contentious issue. But then I'm reminded of Private Baldrick asking Edmund Blackadder about why they are fighting on the Western Front.
The way I see it, these days there's a war on, right? And ages ago there wasn't a war on, right? So there must have been a moment when there not being a war on went away, right? And there being a war on came along.
War is certainly complicated, often with many moving pieces, sparked by numerous events and controversies. Is the Civil War all that different? From the Confederate side of causality, there appears two prevailing and prominent narratives. There's the more romanticized version, to a war in pursuit of achieving a second independence, to receive their own determinism,
At the service of my home, my country.
of reclaiming liberties and freedoms perceived to have been taken away by an oppressive big brother in the north. A war in defense of hearth and home, and of course about federal overreach, about states' rights. And to this side of the argument, even with acknowledgement to the rose-tinted glasses, ignoring that these same notions of liberty were not afforded to everyone, I can't exactly disagree with this certainly forming a significant part of the cause, and for the collective, that simply being patriotism and for patriotism's sake. You then have what would appear to be the other side of the ledger, where Atun-Shei strongly presents his arguments on causality, that this was principally a war to preserve chattel slavery and the interests of the southern agrarian slave-holding aristocracy, to maintain the social order and racial hierarchy, of fears for future insurrection in the wake of John Brown's failed raid on Harper's Ferry. And to this side of the argument, I find it difficult to disagree with him. One need only read the founding documents, recognise what was said by those atop the political hierarchy, in acknowledgement of what southern societies so fervently were reliant upon and for their economic well-being. So why am I confused? Well, it does tend to stem from the use of a single conjunction. That conjunction often used is or, when it would seem more appropriate, at least to me, to utilise an and. Why can't the cause of this war, and from a study of the Confederacy, its inception, its founding documents, be simply summarised as encompassing all of these things? I understand, at least I think I understand, that Atun-Shei's challenge is with those that cannot acknowledge the reality, that slavery was interwoven within the fabric of causality. Hence, if you think it is my intention to just simply tear apart all of Atun-Shei's arguments, best look elsewhere. There is another small channel, though, called Little Boots Productions, starring a talking unicorn and some farm animals. Different, but there are a number of times through his discussion where he raises some fair and reasonable points in rebuttal. Atun-Shei also rightly acknowledges that the Northern cause was principally driven by the desire to preserve the Union, but then it became one seeking to achieve emancipation.
Freeing the slaves wasn't a war aim when this all began, but war changes things, it sorts things out.
As James McPherson will highlight in his work for Cause and Comrades, and while the North also harboured their own racial prejudices, that this wasn't necessarily a wide-scale moral awakening, but where the leadership in the rank and file recognised if they were to defeat the Confederacy, then they also needed to destroy that peculiar institution. The biggest problem I have with the Checkmate Lincolnites series is with the lack of any effort to achieve a semblance of objectivity, to discard of any acknowledgement for the nuance, and then to lean very heavily into the hyperbole. And I think this often undermines some of his better arguments. While war changes things, sorts things out, and where that can be applied to the Union, this can also be somewhat applied to the Confederacy, can it not? Atun-Shei acknowledges, driven by necessity, Patrick Cleburne's proposal in 1864. Then there was Robert Edward Lee, having assumed full command, who would seek to implement and employ the use of Southern African American men in the army in exchange for their freedom. And these sentiments were also simmering away even as early as 1862, and through the likes of Richard Stoddard Ewell. Sure, he was an oddball, and Jefferson Davis hastily shot down the idea, but the leadership were not so stupid into thinking this would be easy. With more setbacks, the discussion evolved into one where the Confederacy would have to reconsider or reevaluate its cause or course of direction, whether it would be the preservation of slavery or to secure their independence and at all costs. Then again, what of those not drafted, but who'd volunteer once the inevitable had become clear, that they would have to give up hearth and home, a rich man's war, a poor man's fight indeed. This does come with its own sincerity for the rank and file, where many were indifferent to cause and politic, who would then find themselves compelled to serve in face of the inevitable tide. I acknowledge that James McPherson would conclude that the Southern and Northern soldiers were more in tune with the politic and when compared to those who served during World War II and the Vietnam War, but he also noted an uptick, beyond just the draft and for the South when things began to go poorly, when it became inevitable that the Union soldier would soon reach their doorstep. Another point, and in respect to Confederate causality, and while Virginia certainly held an interest in preserving slavery, the state itself would literally tear itself in two. That said, it would be the call for 75,000 volunteers and what the old Dominion states saw as federal overreach that would turn the tide with moderates in favour of secession.
And I regret to say the president's hasty calling up of 75,000 volunteers to subdue the rebellion in the cotton states has done nothing to ameliorate the crisis. It has only deepened.
As the largest southern state that contributed more men, generals, had more major engagements on their turf than any other state, the Virginia Secession Convention, and with how that unfolded, certainly highlights there were several moving pieces and multiple motivations to proceed with forging forth with this new nation. Okay, that's enough for the cause and for playing somewhat of a devil's advocate. I personally find the legality and the interpretation of the Constitution to be the more interesting aspect to the discussion, even if the likes of South Carolina simply threw its toys out of the cot and upon Lincoln's election Nevertheless, the question still lingers, at least for me, did the Southern states have the legitimate right to secede in the first place? Anyway, let's talk about black Confederates. For mind, the Checkmate Lincolnites' best episodes are the ones that tackle the topics that include, were there black Confederates, and was it about taxes and tariffs? Aside from the examples he highlights, and if one were to refer to Teamsters or labourers, recruitment when the end was nigh, to Claiborne's effort and desperation as the Army of Tennessee's pool of resources continued to dwindle, to the 1st Louisiana Native Guard, these arguments are often deployed to deflect and obfuscate from Confederate causality, from the cause that includes slavery's preservation and the preservation of the racial hierarchy. Aside from the individual stories, and where I find Atun-Shei generalizes certain unique relationships, framing them to favor his own arguments with his straw man Johnny Reb, I don't find myself disagreeing much with his analysis. To be further charitable, his presentation skills, using split screen where he plays both Billy Yank and Johnny Reb, how he uses the comment section to provide his straw man with dialogue, are all quite clever in my view and clearly effective. As for tariffs and taxes, and while there were grievances with specific southern states who felt that their needs were being neglected by the federal government in favour of their northern counterparts, how the southern states were heavily dependent on imports and would have to pay a premium from the northern states that brokered the trade, and yes, one can't make light of the nullification crisis. And if not for the threat of Lincoln upon chattel slavery, it could have become something else that would serve as that last match struck, and to ignite what would become the conflict between states. Still, the argument of taxes and tariffs as a principal cause usually presents as just another opportunity to deflect and obfuscate from that peculiar institution's role in the conflict, and that led to secession. Now, and alas, this is where my positivity for Atun-Shei films takes a little bit of a nosedive. The video that asks the question, did the Confederacy have better generals, is the perfect example of a video where I might even agree with the conclusion reached, just with very little that led to it an argument. With confidence, arrogance, no confidence, I intend to tackle this one at another time, seeing this is where my enthusiasm for the subject is better placed. Armchair generalship at its finest or at its worst. I'm going to tackle this one another time. Although, and to preface, I have heard counter-arguments and in support of Atun-Shei that his armchair generalship does and should include the moral evaluation of the individual. It is my opinion that that is just plain bulldust. A cop-out, and especially when he goes to great lengths to try and assess from his armchair the specific generalship, campaigns and the strategy, and this is also where I somewhat take issue with his analysis, the morality play and through the lens of modern-day sensibility. And then you have, was it really the War of Northern Aggression? Well, that might depend on who you ask and how one remembers it. But for me, and while it's difficult to dismiss the reliance on this argument to strike back against the North, to fuel the whataboutism game, the efforts to not present the North's actions as not aggressive seem nearly as ridiculous to me at least as those that proclaim slavery was only a minor issue and for the South. One can plot points on a map illustrating how soon-to-serve Confederates took preemptive measures, but Lincoln only proved them right, that he would not let them secede without bloodshed. Whether he was justified is technically irrelevant here, and I'm not here to speculate or discuss whether one should agree or disagree with his decision-making, but to call for 75,000 volunteers and commit them to battle would suggest that Lincoln and the administration possessed of a clear intent, and the means to commit an act of aggression, and then he proceeded to do exactly that. Sure, he thought it would be all over after First Bull Run or First Manassas, as did Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy. Oh, how wrong both would prove to be. This then leads to, was Sherman a war criminal? Even for the standards of the time, if one were to refer to the Labor Code of 1863, there were some more questionable aspects to his command, including a lack of discipline over those termed bummers who would commit acts of looting, arson, assault, and more. The harsh actions taken against the citizenry would also inflict starvation and ultimately result in the death of non-combatants. Yes, Atun-Shei does concede points here to Johnny Reb, especially with Columbia, although I do find it curious how he omitted the inclusion of the Ebenezer Creek incident of December the 9th, 1864, and where upon the army crossing first, Jefferson C. Davis' command would remove the pontoon bridges, leaving the hundreds of former slaves following them to drown or face recapture. This would follow with the quote from Sherman, who would also defend Davis, that the freed people had better go to the rice fields and find work. Perhaps I might be just a little cynical, and while it might not serve his argument, perhaps he did not know of this, rather than he not seeing it as something important to include with the discussion. Then there's the cherry-picking that persists, to make the Union and its actors look as righteous as possible, while demonizing those Confederate generals that would seek retribution. Yes, retribution, I hear you ask, a tooth for a tooth and an eye for an eye. With Jubal Early setting Chambersburg, Pennsylvania alight, extorting the citizens with impossible ransom requests, this was an act of retaliation for the aggression of General David Hunter, applying his own scorched earth tactics in the Shenandoah Valley, tearing through Lexington and putting institutions, buildings, including the Virginia Military Institute, to the torch. I'm not condoning Early's actions, but that context does tend to matter, and Atun-Shei clearly and likely intentionally fails to acknowledge the other side of the ledger. For instance, take the use of Jackson's quote here.
We must destroy industrial establishments wherever we find them, break up their lines of interior commercial intercourse, close the coal mines, seize and, if necessary, destroy the manufactories and commerce of Philadelphia and of other large cities within our reach. Take and hold the narrow neck of the country between Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, subsist mainly on the country we traverse, and make an unrelenting war amidst their homes, force the people of the North to understand what it will cost them to hold the South in the Union at bayonet's point.
But Jackson never really received the opportunity to exact his own measure of scorched earth policy. Robert Edward Lee would have none of it. The quotes used here were also an angry response for the arrival of John Pope from the Western Theatre, placed in command of the newly formed Army of Virginia, who enforced a policy known as Order 11, intent on bringing forth and implementing his own brand of scorched earth policy. Johnny Reb really needed a few more appearances from Ewan McGregor, and in support of his arguments. But let's face it, the Checkmate Lincolnite series was never really interested in presenting or looking to interpret anything on a balanced basis. And no, I'm not advocating that the Confederates did not hold of similar sentiments, and if the shoe were on the other foot. Although certain individuals, like Robert Edward Lee, made some interesting choices to somehow even naively hold true to these lofty goals of unity, state pride, of gentlemen warriors. Lee's troops were under orders to pay for supplies rather than simply seize them outright, granted with currency deemed worthless to Northerners. Still, he would issue orders that prohibited unnecessary destruction of property and forbade soldiers from entering private homes, or taking goods without authorization. But before taking the moral high ground here, the darker element would be still now these courtesies would not be extended to everyone. But the point here is Atun-Shei deviates into whataboutisms to make the likes of Sherman and his tactics look less bad, and also fails to acknowledge how the actions of other generals such as Pope, Milroy, and Hunter exacerbated these harsher policies while their adversaries sought to temper their own views and sentiments and with restraint. Then there's the argument often made to the greater good. With Sherman's tactics, including those of generals such as Pope, Milroy, and Hunter, would he give a more modern-day conflict the same grace? To apply the logic that the ends justify the means, or for the greater good, to say the blockade, should I include a reference to Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan, and the recent war between Israel and Palestine. Now, is it fair to draw direct comparisons between modern-day conflicts and those of the Victorian era, including its participants? Well, no, and that's when one delves into hyperbole. What of heritage, not hate? It's a tad difficult to see how people of modern-day sensibility would not have eyebrows raised. This becomes increasingly more problematic with how the rebel flag of the Army of Northern Virginia has been adopted by future groups and movements that spout of anything but heritage. While there's the more normalised and somewhat acceptable nod through the 70s to the Dukes of Hazzard and among other pop culture offerings, it evidently remains a contentious issue. With that said, I do think making lazy and flippant comparisons across history to be a little uncomfortable. One can be critical of the Confederacy, certainly from a modern-day sensibility, to justify the condemnation around major aspects of the cause, even the major aspect that led to secession, but one can also do so without seeking to drift into direct comparisons with another ugly regime. There is also the sentiment of apples and oranges. Making coherent comparisons across time and place is a difficult and delicate procedure. With the benefit of hindsight and modern-day morality, we can look back and evaluate the behaviours, beliefs, and actions of our predecessors more than 80-odd years in the past. Those of the 1940s also enjoyed this luxury, looking back to the colonies and how they navigated each moral dilemma. Sadly, chattel slavery was a norm within the colonies, and it would take considerable time for firmly established nations, such as England and France, to grapple with their own involvement and bring it to a conclusive end, let alone those former colonies. This isn't to justify the Confederacy nor its independence on that peculiar institution, nor to ignore some obvious parallels that can be identified with Nazi Germany, to their explicit pursuit of preserving or retaining racial hierarchies. Still, context should matter, especially when one draws direct comparisons with very different and more modern regimes, even if some similarity can be identified, and with seeking to understand and interpret the history with meaningful sincerity. Beyond a narrow sense of direct comparison on the basis of racial hierarchy, there's the different core objectives of each. The Confederacy seeking to sadly preserve the ingrained status quo and to what they had grown accustomed through generations, to Nazi Germany pursuing continental conquest and the radical restructuring of Europe. There's the different political structures, the Confederacy being comparatively decentralized and with a strong resistance to central government authority, as opposed to a centralized totalitarian dictatorship with extensive policing and prolonged propaganda. You might think, and with reference to this, whatever, who cares? But the point of difference that troubles me most with these lackadaisical and overtly simplistic comparisons is this: just where is the line? Where does it begin and where does it end? If one makes a comparison between the Confederacy and Nazi Germany, a regime that would embrace systematic and industrialized genocide, does that justify the making of many comparisons with the likes of, say, the Native Americans with the Confederacy, and then by extension with Nazi Germany, of whom many would serve the Confederacy, see more in common with them, including slavery, and in the belief that they might get a better deal in the end, and where one even became a prominent general and the last general to surrender? Again, and understandably, there's a lot of nuance with respect to Stand Watty, but it still doesn't change anything re the point raised. I also wouldn't be so bullish to fixate on racial superiority in the basic sense of black and white, since these other groups found no issue in distinguishing between one another on genealogy. Of course, there is a difference, but this again traverses these murky waters with where one seeks to draw the line. What does that make of James Cowan's comparison drawn between the Maori or early colonials with the Confederacy? While on a much smaller scale, slavery also took place in the South Pacific. Just as with the Native Americans, there were also those who were considered the wrong kind and the right kind of Maori. What should baffle many is that this sort of attitude still exists in modern times. What of the rest of the world? One can talk of Africa, Asia, Europe. The list quickly becomes rather extensive, and the ugly truth is that slavery is a historical and global stain, not one limited to America alone, even focusing upon post the Civil War itself, and as mentioned with the Pacific, and to include the term known as blackbirding, predominantly with Queensland, Australia, serving as its epicentre between 1863 and 1904. There's the Swahili-Arab War in the Congo between 1892 and 1894, the Anglo-Egyptian conquest of Sudan, the Sulu archipelago pirating through Malaysia and the Philippines, the British Black Mountain expeditions, the Franco-Dahomean Wars, the struggles of Cuba and Puerto Rico, Brazil, Mozambique, and the Second Boer War with Transvaal. It might be a reach, though, to draw comparisons between these older societies with that of the Third Reich. Then again, is it a reach? If one considers modern-day rhetoric, it happens all the time, and I've been guilty of my own form of hyperbole on occasion. Hence are we further trivializing these uglier histories, the Confederacy included. Then again, what of the individuals party to it, but not necessarily in lockstep? As I have said before, I am not an American, nor do I believe that I'm somehow the reincarnation of one. But even without ancestors who fought in that horrific conflict between the states, I do find elements to individual stories at least admirable, rather compelling, even inspiring. And one can pick and choose, can't they? I mean, if we're following Atun-Shei, it has become par for the course. Where one wishes to honour their grandpappy, perhaps their family history, and that of the individual, where their personal circumstances might not possess the expected sentiments, or even reflect the norm of that day's collective populace.
I know it's hard to hear that your great-grandpappy was all in for slave labor.
How does Atun-Shei know of every individual story to draw of such sweeping and generalized conclusions? Further, why can't one pick certain aspects of their history to admire and appreciate, if specific to one's Confederate forebears, to their bravery, sense of sacrifice, and to loyalty to their home state, all while acknowledging the not-so-flattering or the so-favourable?
Okay, that is called a compromise.
I understand, at least I think I do, that Atun-Shei's focus is upon those who wish to honour of a fiction, or to create of one. But through his efforts, and while I might enjoy some of his videos, at other times I struggle to see much of a difference between what he presents and what he preaches against. Again, shouldn't context and nuance matter, or is this just another form of ideology and propaganda? For example, when I visited Richmond, I took a picture with my phone of both Jackson's and Lee's statues. I ignored Jefferson Davis. Notably, I've been more impressed and inspired by their personal stories, their military capabilities included, whereas Jefferson Davis is a bit more of a mess. With Jackson, he might be the most fascinating and bizarre general of the conflict that I've studied. Considering modern-day sensibility, the benefit of much hindsight, and with Robert Edward Lee, while I don't respect his racial sentiments, even if moderate for the time, and where I find his specific handling of the Custis estate to be rather reprehensible, I do admire his military leadership as this galvanizing presence that could make such an erratic, eccentric, and proud, shall we say, officer pool into a cohesive unit that could sustain itself for so long as it did. Beyond that, there's his humility, not seeking to capitalize on his own fame, and quietly lead by example in pursuit of reconciliation and the rebuilding of those southern communities decimated through the war, and to his further achievements at what would become Washington and Lee University. Could he have done more, being supportive of Reconstruction? Sure, but again, that doesn't mean I can't recognize certain aspects of his story that remain rather admirable, even compelling. I am also of the mind that what could be recognized as lost cause mythology did more harm to his legacy than good.
If you could go back in time and meet them, their beliefs would have horrified you. These long-dead racists are not your friends. You have nothing in common with them.
Still, and with bearing this in mind,
though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which a people ever fought.
What of the little Napoleon? Beauregard did much to revive and rebuild his home state of Louisiana and the city of New Orleans, had faced his own share of prejudice, and became a prominent advocate for black voting rights, equal protection under the law, and encouraged political participation. What of William Billy Mahone, the founder of the Readjuster Party, and who did arguably more for black civil rights than, well, possibly anyone of note, and up until the civil rights movement itself? Even with slim pickings, see, I can do it too, even with whataboutism with a positive spin. That said, there are plenty of other individual stories throughout the war and post-war worthy of acknowledgement, and yes, even praise. What other elements do I appreciate other than the bravery or their military capability? Well, I do like the music. Southern Soldier might just be my favourite Civil War song, although there are many good ones and it can change for me from time to time. When Johnny Comes Marching Home, the Bonnie Blue Flag, Battle Cry of Freedom, Battle Hymn of the Republic. Spoiled for choice. Curiously, should every statue be torn down, and with every monument dedicated to the individual? Yeah, good question, and not sure about the answer here, but only, and with again, where does it start, and where will it inevitably end? This sort of iconoclasm has become increasingly more commonplace. It has also become quite the thing here in New Zealand also. I feel like I've quickly become a preacher or a broken record, but if seeking to convert those who didn't already possess of such a disposition, or for those more interested in the history beyond a service level analysis, it is at least my opinion that the Checkmate Lincolnites series presents more as a lackluster piece of confectionery, only intent to achieve some shock value, and that seems to be more driven by an agenda than really anything else.